I thought I was just fixing a broken washing machine, but the real thing that came undone that afternoon was us, the walls we'd built around ourselves. I remember the day clearly, though at the time it felt like nothing special. Just another routine repair call. Her washing machine had stopped mid-cycle, she said, and she sounded almost apologetic when she called it a silly thing to bother you with. When I arrived at her house, it was quiet, almost too quiet for a place that had clearly been lived in for years. The curtains were drawn back just enough to let in the soft afternoon light, and the air smelled faintly of detergent, clean, warm, familiar. And then there she was. She opened the door with the kind of grace that didn't need announcing. Mid-40s, poised, with that unshakable confidence women her age often carry, but something else too, a tiredness behind her smile, as though she'd been carrying more than just a faulty appliance on her shoulders. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low and smooth, yet threaded with something I couldn't quite name. I told her it was no trouble, that these machines have a way of misbehaving at the worst times. She smiled at that, just a small curve of her lips, but it lingered long enough for me to notice. She led me inside, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. I couldn't help but feel a little out of place in her home, like I was stepping into a space that had been carefully kept private. The walls were lined with framed photos, family moments frozen in time, but the rooms themselves felt still, as though the laughter in those pictures hadn't touched these walls in a long while. The washing machine sat in the corner of the laundry room, humming faintly, stuck mid-cycle. I crouched down to inspect it, tools in hand, but my focus kept slipping. I could feel her leaning on the doorway, watching. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, more in a way that made me aware. There's something about being observed quietly that stirs the air. You feel the weight of someone's presence without them saying a word. That was how it felt with her. I tried making light conversation, asking when the machine started giving her trouble. She answered politely, but I noticed the way she folded her arms across her chest, not defensive, more like a habit of holding herself together. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and when I glanced back at her, she was studying me. Not rudely, not intrusively. Just noticing. Her eyes carried the kind of attentiveness that made me wonder if she was seeing more than I wanted to reveal. And that's when I felt it, a strange pull, as if I'd stepped into something larger than just a repair job. Her home felt like a closed book someone had finally decided to open, and I was suddenly aware that I was on the first page. I told myself it was just work, just another afternoon. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about a washing machine. This was about her. By the time I'd taken the back panel off the washing machine, I realized this wasn't going to be a quick fix. I mentioned it to her lightly, and she just gave a nod, as if she'd already expected more than just a simple adjustment. "You've got time, right?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. "I do," I said, though the truth was I would have made time regardless. Something about her voice had a way of pressing pause on everything else. She disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, and I heard the gentle sounds of cupboards opening, water filling the kettle, the click of a switch. Soon, the warm fragrance of brewing tea drifted down the hallway, wrapping itself around me like a soft invitation. When she returned, she carried 2 mugs, steam curling upward, catching the fading light from the window. "You look like you could use a break," she said with a half-smile, setting one on the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. I hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to sit," she interrupted, her voice gentle but steady, as if she was used to making decisions in a house that had long been too quiet. So I sat. And there we were, across from each other at her kitchen table. The window let in just enough sunlight to wash the counters in gold. There was a bowl of fruit between us, the faint ticking of a wall clock, and for a moment it felt like we were the only 2 people in the world. At first, the talk was light: the weather, the quirks of old appliances. But as we sipped our tea, the conversation shifted naturally into deeper waters. She told me her son had left for university a year ago. She laughed softly as she admitted the house had never felt so big and so empty at the same time. I told her about my family, how my younger sister was still figuring life out, how my parents still treated me like I was younger than I was. She listened closely, chin resting lightly against her palm, eyes never drifting away. There was something disarming about her attention. Most people listen while already preparing their reply. She didn't. She just listened. Every word felt like it mattered. When she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers lingered for a second at her neck. A small, unconscious gesture, but I noticed. Just as I noticed how her laugh softened the lines at the corner of her mouth, or how her hand circled the mug as though she needed the warmth more than the tea itself. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full. Full of the things we weren't yet saying, full of the closeness that builds not through touch but through presence. And I remember thinking, this didn't feel like a stranger's kitchen anymore. It felt like a place I'd stumbled into but somehow belonged. Her smile, when it finally broke the quiet, carried more than politeness. It carried recognition, like she, too, felt that this was no longer just about tea or small talk. Something else was stirring here. After finishing our tea, I returned to the laundry room with a clearer idea of what needed fixing. A belt had slipped, nothing major, though it would take a little patience to realign. I crouched down again, tools spread neatly beside me, the smell of detergent and metal mixing in the air. I could hear her moving about behind me, the faint shuffle of slippers on the tiled floor, the clink of her cup as she rinsed it in the sink. She wasn't hovering, but she was near enough that her presence filled the space. "You must get calls like this all the time," she said at last, her voice light, almost playful. "More than I can count," I replied, adjusting the drum. "Machines break. People call. I fix them." There was a pause. Then, in a tone softer and more deliberate, she said, "But sometimes it's not the machine that's broken. Sometimes it's me." I froze. My hand tightened on the wrench without meaning to. Slowly, I turned toward her. She was leaning against the doorframe, her arms relaxed at her sides this time, her face angled just enough that the light caught her features. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to hide the truth. I didn't answer right away. The moment felt too fragile to rush. She exhaled, almost laughing at herself. "I'm sorry. That sounded strange, didn't it?" "No," I said quietly. "Not strange." She tilted her head, studying me. "Things just slip through my fingers lately. Little things. I forget, I misplace, I break. I tell myself it's nothing," but her voice faltered for just a second, then steadied. "Sometimes I think it's me who's falling apart, not the things around me." The hum of the half-open machine filled the silence that followed, low and constant, as if grounding us both. I wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but all I managed was, "Everyone breaks sometimes." It sounded simple, but she didn't dismiss it. She let the words settle, her eyes softening as though she appreciated them more than she'd expected to. When she stepped closer, the air between us shifted. She didn't come too near, just enough that I could feel the change, the warmth of her presence brushing the edge of mine. "Maybe that's why things feel so heavy," she murmured. "Because no one's around to notice when they do." Her honesty hung there, open and vulnerable. I set the wrench down and leaned back on my heels, looking up at her. And in that still moment, I realized this wasn't about a washing machine at all. Machines could be tightened, reset, repaired. But the loneliness in her voice, that wasn't something you fixed with tools. I nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging what neither of us had truly said aloud. The problem wasn't the machine. It was her. And, somehow, it was already me too. I shifted the machine slightly to get a better angle, the back panel half open like a chest waiting to be mended. My hands were busy, but my mind kept circling back to her words. About things breaking. About her. I heard her footsteps approach, slow and measured, until I felt her presence just over my shoulder. She crouched down beside me, curiosity lacing her voice. "So this is what the inside of a washing machine looks like," she said, leaning in. Her shoulder brushed mine. Lightly, casually. But it didn't move away. I swallowed, focusing on the belt I was trying to align, pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from her arm. The faint fabric of her sweater grazed my sleeve, soft against the rough cotton of my shirt. "Not very glamorous, is it?" I murmured, trying to keep my tone even. No, she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. But it's fascinating, watching someone know exactly what to do. Her words lingered, close to my ear, as though she didn't realize how near she'd come. Or maybe she did. I shifted slightly to reach for a screwdriver, and in that movement, her hair brushed my cheek. Just the lightest touch, like a whisper of contact. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the machine instead of turning toward her. Sorry, she laughed softly, pulling a strand of hair back behind her ear. I'm probably in your way. You're not, I said, too quickly, too firmly. And I meant it. For a moment we both stayed there, side by side in that narrow space, pretending to study the mechanics, but really just feeling the nearness. The steady hum of the half-fixed washer filled the silence, a kind of background heartbeat to the moment. She shifted her weight slightly, and her knee brushed mine. Not a deliberate touch, not exactly. But neither of us moved back. I stole a glance at her. Her eyes were lowered, watching my hands work, though I noticed the corners of her mouth curve in a quiet, almost private smile. A smile that said she knew this was more than accidental. The screwdriver slipped in my hand, not enough to cause harm, but enough for her to notice. You okay? She asked softly. Yeah, I said, clearing my throat. Just distracted. Her eyes lifted to mine then, steady, searching. I thought so. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to just that look, her gaze holding mine, the closeness of our bodies, the silence alive with meaning. Then she leaned back slightly, giving me space again, though her smile lingered. Well, she said lightly, I'll let you get back to your glamorous work. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. The warmth of her touch still clung to me, even as she stepped away. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Something small, maybe. Something unspoken. But something neither of us could pretend away. By the time the machine finally gave a steady whir, I knew the repair was done. The belt was aligned, the drum steady, the water flowing where it should. I packed away my tools, but my hands moved slower than they needed to. Something in me wasn't ready to leave. She must have sensed it too, because instead of walking me to the door, she said, sit for a while. You've earned it. I hesitated, but she was already leading me toward the living room. It was a warm, inviting space, soft lamplight spilling across bookshelves, a few framed pictures on the mantel, a sofa that looked well-worn but comfortable. I lowered myself onto the edge of the cushions, careful at first, like I didn't quite belong. She sat beside me, not too close, not too far, and for a moment we both just listened to the faint hum of the washing machine still running in the other room. She was quiet at first, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Then, almost as if she had rehearsed the words many times but never spoken them aloud, she said, You know, it's been a long time since I let anyone in here. I turned to her. Into the living room? I asked gently, trying to soften the weight I heard in her tone. She gave a small laugh, though it was edged with sadness. Into my home. Into my space. She shook her head, as though scolding herself. It's easier to keep things simple, you know? Easier not to invite people in. Not to open yourself up to all the complications. Her fingers toyed absently with a ring on her right hand. Not a wedding band, but something delicate silver that caught the light each time she moved. I let her words hang in the air. There was no rush. No need to press. Finally, she looked at me, really looked. But then someone shows up to fix a washing machine, and suddenly it doesn't feel so simple anymore. Her eyes didn't waver from mine. And in that look, I knew she wasn't just talking about appliances. My chest tightened, though I kept my voice steady. Complicated isn't always a bad thing. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind of smile that carries both longing and hesitation. She exhaled softly, as if the act of admitting even that much had taken more from her than she'd expected. I didn't reach for her hand. Not yet. But the urge was there, strong and unshakable, lingering in the space between us. The lamp flickered faintly, shadows swaying across the room. The world outside felt very far away. And sitting there beside her, I realized something had shifted again. This wasn't about tea or machines or even conversation anymore. This was about the loneliness she'd carried for too long, and the unexpected way she had just placed a piece of it in my hands. The living room had grown quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of silence that begs to be filled with chatter, but the kind that carries weight, pressing against the air until even the smallest sound feels amplified. She was still seated beside me on the sofa, her body angled slightly toward mine. Her hand rested lightly against her lap, fingers curled, not tense, but not entirely relaxed either. The lamplight softened her features, casting a glow that made her look both strong and heartbreakingly fragile. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. So instead, I simply sat there, aware of the way the cushion dipped beneath her, the faint warmth radiating between us, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away again. Once, twice. And on the third time, she didn't look away. That was the moment everything else fell out of focus. I felt her gaze like a touch, steady, searching, daring me to hold it. And I did. The seconds stretched long. My hand, resting nervously against my knee, twitched slightly as though it wanted to move closer, to bridge the tiny gap that suddenly felt like an ocean. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was too much at stake in that pause. She leaned ever so slightly nearer, not enough to close the distance, but enough that I caught the faintest trace of her perfume, subtle, floral, almost hidden, like a secret kept close to the skin. Funny, she whispered, though her voice was so soft I almost wondered if I imagined it. How someone you barely know can suddenly feel familiar. I swallowed, my throat dry. Yeah, I managed. It is. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say more, but nothing came. And maybe it didn't need to. The truth was already there, suspended in the silence between us. The house felt smaller in that moment, as though the walls had drawn in closer, as though every sound outside, the distant passing of a car, the hum of the washing machine still spinning, had dimmed just enough to leave only us. Her hand shifted slightly in her lap. Not toward me, not quite. But I noticed the subtle movement, the almost imperceptible hesitation. My chest tightened with the ache of wanting to reach, to close the distance, to let her know that I felt it too. But neither of us moved. And yet, it was as if everything had already happened. The nearness, the glances, the quiet acknowledgement that this connection was more than accidental. Her breath trembled softly, and I realized mine did too. We sat there, suspended in that fragile space where a single motion, a hand extended, a word spoken, could change everything. But we stayed still. And somehow, that restraint, that unspoken longing, felt more intimate than any kiss could have. Eventually, the silence shifted, not broken, but softened, like a tide that had finally decided to pull back. She leaned against the sofa cushion, her eyes dropping for the first time since they'd met mine. It was enough to let the moment breathe again, enough to remind us both that the world outside still existed. I cleared my throat, not because I had something important to say, but because I needed the courage to speak at all. "The machine's fixed," I murmured, almost regretting the practicality of the words as soon as I said them. She smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know." Then, after a pause, "But maybe that wasn't what needed fixing most." Her words lingered in the space between us, tender and heavy at once. I wanted to answer, but no neat reply came. All I could do was nod, as though admitting silently that I understood. When I finally stood to gather my tools, she rose too. We walked slowly to the door, neither of us in any hurry. The hallway felt longer on the way out, each step echoing the quiet truth that something inside these walls had shifted. At the door, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge. For a moment, she didn't look at me, she just studied the night beyond the glass. The cool evening air seeped in as she cracked the door open, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. And then, finally, she turned back. Her eyes searched mine one last time, softer now, less guarded. "You know," she said gently, "not everything has to be repaired all at once." I nodded again, though this time there was a small smile tugging at my lips. "Maybe not," I said. "But it helps to know what's worth repairing." Her hand brushed mine as she passed back the small wrench I'd nearly forgotten. It wasn't deliberate, not entirely. But it was slow enough, lingering enough, that I felt the warmth of her skin long after the tool was in my grip. We stood there a moment longer. Just long enough. And then I stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapping around me like a reminder that the world was waiting. The sound of the door closing behind me wasn't sharp or final. It was gentle, careful. Like she, too, wasn't ready to shut it all the way. As I walked to my car, I knew this wasn't just about a washing machine, or even about loneliness. It was about the strange, unexpected way two people could find themselves standing at the edge of something they hadn't planned for, something fragile, something real. Whether it would grow, whether we'd meet again, I didn't know. But I did know this. That day had left a mark on both of us. And sometimes, it's not the fixing that matters most. It's the noticing.